This is Fatina Hardy and I'm here with Rebecca Lim. This is our 7th episode of Australia's immigration policy, the Manus story 2013 to 2020. So last time we spoke about the men and you shared some details about their situation and who they were. Thought it would be really great for us right now to talk about what happened around 2019 when the men were starting to be moved from Manus into Port Moresby. So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about that.
Hi Fatina, thank you for having me back again. Yes, throughout 2019, prior to that there were men from Manus who were taken to Port Moresby, those who had kind of serious medical conditions, and progressively the numbers, more and more men were being sent to Port Moresby. So that happened throughout 2019.
And so when you said they were sent to Port Moresby, they were sent to what, to the hospitals there or for health reasons?
Mainly for health reasons. Accommodation consisted of motel-type accommodation scattered across Port Moresby. So the men were still in mandatory detention, if you like, with the freedom to walk the streets, It still doesn't mean that they were not detained. There were some men prior to this particular time who had opted to go and live in Port Moresby, and so they were living in the community. So my involvement, my last visit to Manus was probably early 2019, and subsequent to that, after that, I did not go back to Manus because, there were less and less men there, but spent more time in Port Moresby. Okay. But having said that, every visit to Manus, more than 15 visits, I always had to transit through Port Moresby. So there was always one night, or at least 2 nights, in Port Moresby. So I kind of used the time productively and had meetings with relevant and key stakeholders, faith-based, non-faith-based, people in decision-making positions as well.
How did you manage to get those meetings?
I suppose over the period of time, I got to know more and more people. And if I might say so myself, I am good at networking. I am good at establishing relationships. Yeah. Of course, the Catholic Church was the main source because I'm a Catholic and I probably went to every village church in Manus, throughout Manus, some of the islands in Papitalai. And at this time, I also was introduced to the Secretary of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, though the person before Father Giorgio Licini, who's now the current president. So I met his predecessor.
Is this in New Guinea or is this here?
In Port Moresby. So the Catholic Bishops' Conference, CBC, PNGSI, PNG Solomon Islands. Okay. The head office is based in Port Moresby. Uh-huh. So I made it my business to get to know them because I could foresee their support on the ground was going to be really, really important. Yeah. And individuals are kind of doing God's mission and doing God's work. So I remember at a meeting, and I met Father Giorgio, who was coming into the position, and I tried to explain to him what the situation was. And he had some idea from reading different articles. I had an article as well. And prior to that, of course, I had met Father Ambrose Pereira, who was actually in Brisbane for a short time, and I met him at Brigidine College at Indooroopilly. And I knew that he had been working Solomon Islands for a long time, and then he was posted to Port Moresby. So when I walked into the office, there was Ambrose standing there, and I said, "Ambrose?" He says, "Oh, yes, hello." So I said, "Introduce me." So there you go, Ambrose, it's his fault. And so then I remember the first meeting prior to Father Giorgio taking on that position. Being an Italian, he had kind of understood the whole refugee asylum seeker boat journey, Lampedusa, Pope Francis, so on and so forth. I could just see his eyes kind of like bulging out when I talked about Australia's policy and what we're doing to the men, having sent them to PNG. After the first meeting, I let it all sink in, and then he took over as the General Secretary. And subsequently, I spoke with him and Ambrose, and as a result of that, Ambrose actually coordinated the very first public panel/information session in Port Moresby about the Manus refugees.
And who was that open to? You said it was public, but was it aimed at just the local people or also the decision makers?
So the audience consisted of young people from many of the Catholic schools and the colleges, so in kind of year 11 and 12. Also the clergy, the religious sisters and priests, many of whom had already been supporting some of the men there. But the panelists, it was deliberate to invite a representative from PNG Immigration. We also had somebody from the Office of Human Rights, the UN Human Rights. We also had the mayor of Port Moresby. We had Father Clement from Manus. We had a refugee, Benam Sata, who is now in Paris, in France. So it was quite a wide-ranging, it was a very good panel, I think. That was the first time we had the media, lots of the PNG media. Australian media covered a little bit, and Radio New Zealand is always very supportive has always provided some positive coverage for us. Australian media is a bit slow, maybe purposely, not sure. So I think that was the very first start about how these issues were raised in Port Moresby, and now that the men were in Port Moresby, how do we care for them, that kind of situation. So, so during, the time, and of course it was during this time that the Medevac legislation was passed in March 2019.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that all kind of, a little bit about what was going on behind the scenes, I guess?
Yeah, Dr. Karen Phelps and Labour and the Greens, there was a lot of, I guess, prior to the Medevac legislation, there was a lot of information that was coming back to Australia about the situation of the men's health. And so, Karen Phelps and others and the doctors kind of were advocating, the medical treatment that was available in Port Moresby and PNG was really not satisfactory for men who had pre-existing medical conditions, chronic illnesses, deteriorating mental health. The expertise was not there, the facilities was not there, lack of medication. So that's kind of, how the Medevac legislation came about, and the doctors that were involved were all voluntary doctors who spent copious amounts of time, reading people's files and doing reports, and mostly speaking with the men when the men were well enough to speak with the doctors. So I guess during the time I was in Moresby, during this period, a lot of my on-the-ground work at the CBC offices / Caritas as well, PNG, was about helping to send back medical reports, liaising with the doctors and the men, to kind of get all this information back.
And I guess that's what I was wondering about, the behind the scenes of some of the stuff that you might have been doing around that as well, in supporting the men to have their stories heard.
Yeah, not only just their stories, but their medical records sent back, and appointments, lining up appointments. Of course, some men were so sick and they were not able to do that, so how do we get around that? We won't talk publicly about that, but, everything was kind of lawful, but it was, I suppose for me, the intention really of sharing all this is to show how difficult offshore, it's not even processing, it's offshore detention is, when you just kind of send people to another country, for processing, and then it becomes indefinite detention. No country takes responsibility because it's two countries, one country is funding, i.e. Australia, another country has to implement the policy, and so it's like when something happens, who takes responsibility? I'm sure there's enough media coverage when something happens, whether it's a person who's a custodial death or somebody who's really, really sick and needs to be medevaced urgently. Who takes responsibility for that? We've seen so many reports where Australia has says, well, PNG is a sovereign country. PNG says, we're doing our best, but Australia's funding. So my message is, offshore detention, processing / detention must never happen again.
Because these men are in absolute no man's land, and as you say, they'll slip through the cracks because no one's taking responsibility, other than people like you, the doctors, the churches, the local people, people who are volunteering their time to be able to do this.
Yeah, and the Refugee Council, being the peak body in Australia, has had to coordinate a lot of this, and also the legal sector in Australia. Many, many people have worked very, very hard pro bono to get people's files. And when Medevac was a good piece of legislation, unfortunately, it was repealed. But having said that too, there were people who were sent to Australia for medical treatment prior to Medevac. Australian Border Force, have transferred people themselves, and some lawyers. The legal sector has also been able to successfully transfer people here for medical treatment. But basically, you've got to be comatose before you're transferred by ABF. You're already so sick. So the
Yes.
legislation really was at the right time. I mean,
Yes.
we shouldn't even have had it
Yeah.
because we shouldn't even have offshore detention.
No.
But anyhow, to kind of say that. So there was a lot of work behind the scenes. Tribute to every single person.
Yes.
Many advocates, many individuals. The men themselves were helping each other as well. The ones who were so sick had to be helped by the Brotherhood of Manus, if you like. It's a very special relationship. They were they're all friends, or many of them are friends, regardless of whether they come from the same ethnic group or same country.
Yes.
I guess they were all in it together.
And I guess that's, there's two things that I'm thinking. One of them is the absolute amount of resources, the voluntary resources that have gone into supporting the men. But then, yes, what this has created for the men in terms of the relationships and the closeness and I guess the support for each other.
I mean, that's right. In another kind of episode, we'll talk about what's currently happening for the men who were medically transferred, prior to Medevac and post-Medevac as well, and the situation for them here. But if we go back to 2019, I mean, even the people in Port Moresby themselves, the religious sisters, the non-religious people, the community, I mean, if people hear this, when people hear this, they kind of think it's paradise. It's paradise to the PNG people. It's not paradise when you're a foreigner. I've also been asked before, but there's heaps of migrant workers. Yes, a migrant is a migrant. A migrant chooses to work there, and there's lots of migrant workers in PNG from Philippine background, from Chinese background, but people choose to go there and work.
That's the point, isn't it? They choose and they can leave when they want to.
That's right. Australia has forcibly sent people seeking protection or asylum to PNG. They don't have one talk. PNG is not a resettlement country, and neither is Nauru, and the UNHCR has said that in their reports. It works on a one-talk system, which is relatives. It works on land systems. You're a foreigner.
Yes.
I mean, of course, and PNG is also kind of having to manage the West Papuan refugees, of which there are thousands in Port Moresby. So you've just got this extra group of foreigners now who are from countries that are so foreign. And, and PNG is not a safe country even for the PNG nationals. In some areas, Brisbane's not safe. If we're silly enough to kind of walk somewhere at some time, that kind of stuff, we could be attacked as well. But what I'm just trying to say is that, it really is a different culture, it's a different country, it's not a resettlement country for refugees.
And I guess the other thing is that it's not necessarily, the majority of the population would not necessarily be well off. So you've got that other, when you're thinking about people, what am I trying to say? When we're thinking about people who might be seen, like they might be seen as a threat because there aren't as many jobs, the welfare system isn't there, the medical system isn't there.
I mean, that's right. Many PNG nationals are saying, we don't even have enough, medication for ourselves. We haven't got the systems, and then here we've got, a whole heap of extra foreigners who are sick.
Yes.
So how do we kind of manage it, right?
That was around the early 2019. So how long have you been working with the people at Port Moresby, since the transfer from Manus?
Yeah, so October, November, December I made 2 trips during that time of 2019. And that kind of was the whole, towards the Medevac and doing a lot of on the ground stuff, and more men. And Manus, well, they say Manus was closed, and towards the end of 2019, 1 or 2, 3 or 4 people remain on Manus at the time of this particular podcast. But people were scattered across motels, so involved a lot of, and at this time, it was also the asylum seekers. About 52 of them were detained in Bomana Prison, Bomana Immigration Detention Center. So that was quite traumatic for that group of people. And I was on the ground, when the first group of men were kind of released because they kind of signed and said, we'll go home kind of thing. But obviously, that was carrot and stick kind of situation for the men to be able to come out. Also went to meet a few of them, and, what the stories that they've said, the experiences of what they endured in Bomana is really quite horrific. It sounds a bit like Guantanamo Bay, really. I mean,
really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The men will tell you they didn't have enough food to eat. The lights were on at all times of the night. I remember something someone said to me, and I don't get too upset now because I think I'm beyond that. I'm more angry. He said one of his friends was so damaged that when he saw an insect on the ground, he would pick that insect up and he would walk to the fence and release that insect.
Oh my goodness.
So for him, it was like the freedom.
Yes.
So that was just one story. So many men were so damaged, because they had been in Bomana, I don't know, 30 days or 60 days or something. So at the time of this podcast, everyone's been released from Bomana. No one else, no one from those original groups who were in Bomana. And some of them have been resettled, have managed to get refugee status thanks to UNHCR. And they've been resettled in the States, Canada, in France. But that's a terrible time in history.
Yes.
And Australia should be ashamed of themselves. They've put people in that kind of situation where you haven't got a visa. So PNG says, well, you haven't got a visa. You've got no right to be here. You don't want to go home. We can't deport you. So we'll just detain you. Of course, Australia says, oh, it was PNG government. But really, without Australia enabling it, it would not have happened.
So they were imprisoned because
They were.
Yeah. That sounds like a real blight on our history and that we as Australians will have to live with into the future now.
Yes, everything about offshore detention is quite terrible.
So you were saying that most of the men now have been released from Bomana, that the last time you were there was at the end of last year, basically. Are there many men left in Port Moresby?
I think the numbers now are probably under 180 because those who have been accepted for resettlement by the US are still going despite COVID. I mean, smaller and smaller numbers. So we're in early August now. So 2 weeks ago or last week, 8 or 9 of them, flew out from Port Moresby, majority to the US. I think a couple might have gone to other countries. So, and there are a few more who are waiting, who have been accepted by the US and are waiting to leave. So they will kind of stagger that because of COVID, probably.
Yes.
And then, hopefully, majority of them will be resettled.
Do you think there'll be many that will stay in Port Moresby or in PNG?
There are a handful of men with families, with a wife, a PNG national wife, majority Manus, some others are from other provinces, have got children. It may be their choice to stay, depending on what the resettlement there is no resettlement program in PNG as such. So what is that going to look like for them? We're not sure.
And so who continues to provide support to these men in terms of where they go or what happens to them, or like who's providing that support?
In terms of funding them now, your tax was in mind, so we're still funding. We're still paying for people to be living detained in Port Moresby. What will happen to them in the future? The US seems to be the only resettlement option. That's a government-initiated resettlement option. Those people who have been denied the US, there is no plan B. As the acting minister keeps saying, plan B is to return to Nauru, PNG, settle in PNG, Nauru, go home to your home country, or wait for another option. But it's really not our job to resettle people. Yeah, it's the government's job to resettle. People know about Canada. Canada is not the government's plan. Canada is a community initiative. Of course, we've already lodged some applications for Canada, so that will take a bit of time. But why are we kind of speculating all this when it's really, the government's job?
And so are you continuing to support some of the men in Port Moresby?
Yes, I'm in contact with Father Giorgio Licini, as often as we need to be. And occasionally there will be somebody who might need particular help, whether it's the counsellors reaching out or the doctors reaching out. So I'm kind of bridging, liaising, sending information back and forth, providing whatever support I can, mainly linking people with others.
Yes.
And on-the-ground support. Yeah. It's really important. Really, really, really grateful to Catholic Bishop Conference, CBC, as well as Caritas PNG, because without them, things would be a million times worse without any on the ground. And this is a result of Australia imposing. I mean, this is all voluntary. No one's asked the CBC or Caritas to do it, of course. But this is human lives. We can't just watch people die, basically.
And it sounds like all of that work that you did in PNG, in Port Moresby, the pulling people together, the networking, that has now created, really built some capacity for people on the ground to be supporting the men that are still there.
Okay, I take a little bit of credit. But at the end of the day, no matter how how much you bring relationships together and people together. If they don't want to do it, they don't want to do it as well, right? So I think it's, they are truly the missionaries of God, I suppose, if you want to put it that way. It's their faith that drives them to kind of help people. And we've got lots of other ordinary, when I say, I don't mean ordinary, but people not in positions of power, but the person on the street who has befriended the men. But at the end of the day, that's not their country. And the men, someone once said to me, you can probably go for 4 days without food. You might be able to go for 4 days without water, maybe 4 minutes without air before you kind of start gagging. But can you survive even 4 seconds without hope? It's not easy. No. So really the men have, this is their 8th year of not knowing what the future is for those who are not going to the US, who have not been accepted or are being denied by the US. They don't know what their options are. And I just think we underestimate. If we don't have hope, how do we manage our lives? It's just hard. So the people who are still stranded offshore and the people who are here, medical treatment, who've got no hope, don't know what's happening. That's the worst thing, is not being told. And then you have some plan of no action that's been promoted by the acting minister. That's not even, there's a plan of inaction, really. It's not even a plan. It's really hard. We really top marks to the men. They're so resilient and they're so brave.
I was going to say, I think that's the thing that really sticks out for me, and the systematic removal of hope of the men is so tragic and so appalling. I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Next time I'd like us to talk more about now the current situation for those men that were medevaced out here in Australia. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thanks, Bettina. Till the next time, listeners.
Bye.
Bye for now.